My name is Lori Ann Feivel, and I am honored to be the president of Bexley City Council. I want to thank the Bexley Public Library and the Bexley's favorite librarian, Ben Heckman, for hosting us tonight. In addition to welcoming everyone, I was asked to set the rules for tonight's conversation and to share my own personal story. So with a grateful heart, I welcome all the panelists and organizers of tonight's town hall, as well as all of those who are joining us on Facebook Live. The topics and issues that challenge our nation, our state, and our hometown of Bexley are not new, but have hit us in the face hard in the last few weeks with the brutal murder of George Floyd, and they need to be addressed. We will not rectify them tonight, but our community is continuing a conversation that must be part of our everyday dialogue until we do. Please remember that each person willing to be a panelist tonight had to put on his or her brave to attend this evening and will be sharing their own personal feelings and thoughts. This is not going to be easy, but Bexley doesn't need easy to make this a success. We are one Bexley, and we are Bexley strong. When my patients are most stressed, I try very hard to hear the mantra of Fred Rogers in my head. Mr. Rogers teaches us that there are 3 ways to success. Those are: number 1, to be kind. Number 2, to be kind. And you guessed it, number 3, to be kind. After reminding my children to start their day with their kind foot forward, I tell my children as I plant a big kiss goodbye on their cheek, make mistakes. And they echo back and learn from them. They are the reason I wake up every morning. They are the reason for the love in my heart. They are the reason for the laughter in our home. But they are also the cause of the gray in my hair as I worry for their future. FDR suggests that we may not be able to prepare the future for our children, but we can at least prepare our children for their future. For what kind of future are we preparing our children? What words of wisdom can we share? As I prepared to start my first year as a teacher, following in my father's footsteps, I remember him saying that I should be sure to befriend the school custodian and show the local police nothing but respect. I didn't question his advice. However, I have found his words of wisdom to have benefited my life on numerous occasions. While I wish he were around now to explain himself, knowing that my father, a rural, small-town kid, fresh out of college, started his career teaching high school math on the west side of Dayton in 1965, I suspect it has something to do with the fact this would have placed him smack dab in the middle of the historic racial riots of 1966 that occurred on the west side of Dayton. Alone in a new city, no doubt the events of that period were unsettling for him, and the individuals who he leaned on helped him to navigate his situation. And so, from generation to generation, we teach our children what we know to be true, and our children listen. I call so many of the individuals who have made it their calling to don the uniform of the Bexley Police my friends. More than a few times, the Bexley PD has come to my rescue. But my favorite times to recall are when Officer Ayers and Sergeant Holdren, 21 years ago, rescued my then toddler from a locked bathroom. And 2 years ago, when Officers Fleming and Erickson, after doing all they could to save my father-in-law's life, hugged my devastated children as the ambulance drove away. As my father insisted, I respect these kind-hearted friends of mine, and I have taken advantage of my position to get to know them as people, not just as city employees. But even before I had this gig, I taught my children to run to the police, not only for safety, but to thank them for their service. And my son won't pass a person in uniform, whether they are a police officer, a firefighter, or a part of the United States Armed Forces, without saying thank you. This is my story. It comes as no surprise that my story, as a white woman with white children, is different than the stories of my black friends. Sadly, this is not the story that the mother of one of my son's very best friends would share. She would never tell her son to make mistakes. He, like so many, has been taught that there is no wiggle room for mistakes. Our black babies learn from their parents and from the horrific events they witness on TV, or God forbid in person, that meeting just that one individual in a uniform that does not put their kind foot forward can be a disastrous encounter, indeed a fatal one. I have faith in the kind hearts of the individuals who govern our city, the kind hearts of the Bexley officers who are sworn to keep every one of us safe, and the kind hearts of our community members. I know that all of these groups will be willing to do the heavy lifting. We need to listen intently and strategize actively to change the narrative for so many families in Bexley, in Ohio, and in the United States. We must work hard together, Bexley, so that every parent can kiss their baby on the cheek and feel safe to tell them to make mistakes. We are going to now shift to the Baker family, who are right across from me. I believe Courtney is going to start us off.
Hi, everyone out there. I'm Courtney Baker. I am a Bexley resident. I've been in Bexley now for 15 years. I'm really proud to live in Bexley, and I'm not on any formal committee. I'm not a part of the Bexley City Council. Really, I'm just here as a community member at large. But I want to say I am, very proud and honored to be a part of this discussion tonight. And I think the very unique thing, and the thing that brings me a lot of pride about Bexley, is that this isn't the conversation that just started in the wake of George Floyd's death. We have been having conversations for several years now about how we can figure out new ways of healing old wounds. Here in Bexley, here within our communities of color. And I'm really honored that we have gotten support from the mayor, from the chief, from the police department about how we can begin to, how we can continue to bridge those gaps. I appreciate you sharing, Lori, about your story. I think for me, briefly, just a little bit about me is that I have never had a bad encounter with police. I love that I've never had a bad encounter with police. But even saying that I am a Black woman who went to Georgetown, I have an advanced degree, I'm married, I have kids, I've never done anything illegal. I don't want to do anything illegal. I am actually, I think, a pretty good person. Every time I see cop lights in my rearview mirror, I feel scared. every time I see a motorist stopped along Broad Street or Main Street, I look, is this person black? Is this person being stopped for some other reason than just being black and driving? So these are kinds of things that I hope that we can continue to dialogue and talk about and be real about how they affect us, how they affect people like me, how they don't affect people like you in the same way. So I really do appreciate this time. I'm gonna throw it over to my husband, Jonathan.
Thanks, Courtney. So for me, growing up in a 98% African American neighborhood, maybe 99% African American neighborhood, I was always taught I survived by just being told to stay out of the white neighborhood. You know, to stay away from, I would go jogging. My mother said, nope, you don't cross that bridge. You just turn your butt around and go back the other direction. And so I never envisioned living in where I'm the only African American family for 10 years or so, and then someone else moved in on our block. In college, I survived by learning how to negotiate the boundaries a little bit. And so for me, I thought about it this way, you know, in the workplace, you know, if you have a hostile environment, you call HR. In an academic setting, in K-12, if you feel bullied, you talk to the principal. And so surely if someone at work was to hit you or someone at school was to hit you, then that's assault, that's a fight, probably a bad thing that's gonna happen. But hostility eats away at you. Feeling bullied can eat away at you. And so if I'm feeling a bit of hostility from law enforcement, if I'm feeling a little bit of bullying by law enforcement, then I'm not gonna feel protected or served. And a $20 bill can be the tipping point, if you will, in different ways. And so you might feel justified with the graffiti that tags different buildings downtown. You might feel justified singing a song by a local rapper or Roddy Ricch, or for some of you older people, NWA. And so that doesn't feel good. In fact, if you feel that bullying or that harassment, you don't stick around that environment too long. And so I think we definitely need to de-escalate where appropriate in the short term. We need to establish trust in the long term. We need to look at policy, make some decisions, look at our priorities as Bexley. And so I think that's where 12, right? You can Google that, as Austin would say, comes into play. That we want to move the needle for minorities and African Americans in this community away from the feeling. Now, it may not always be true, the feeling of harassment and bullying, and moving that needle more towards feeling protected and served. And so we want to definitely have you comment in the thread. We know we have about 100 viewers. Let's keep it going. If you have questions, we have moderators who are going to be looking at that as well. But I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Kessler now.
Thank you, John. Good evening. I want to also thank the library for hosting us this evening. I feel a little guilty that we're here in the library and no one else gets to be in the library right now, so sorry. Sorry, Internet. But thank you to Ben Heckman and the library for making this space available for us. It's a perfect place for conversation. I want to thank the Bexley Minority Parents Alliance, Dr. Baker, Courtney Baker, and off camera, you don't see this, but Brian Dury and Monika Williams are over there getting ready to take your questions on the thread. And they have been great in being partners over the years and talking through and exploring the issues we're talking about tonight. And certainly a big partner in encouraging this town hall and helping to organize it and set it up. I want to thank you guys for spending some of your time this evening with us so that we can hear from you and share our thoughts and have this dialogue together. Bexley's history is complex, but it's also all too familiar across many similar communities across our country. Bexley started out as a privileged enclave, a first-ring suburb. It was a melding of mansion-lined streets and the academic Pleasant Ridge area. And it has enjoyed throughout its time a special place in the Columbus map, a place where you go to Bexley and you maybe have a certain type of house, you maybe have a certain type of car, you maybe have a certain type of lifestyle. And Bexley's been around for a while, so we have been around through the era of segregation. We've been around through the era of deed restrictions. And as Courtney mentioned, the complicated histories and the difficult histories and the difficult hurts and the difficult memories that are associated with our collective past continue to haunt us, and I think will for generations. And so it's incumbent upon us, as we diversify further as a community, to learn from the past and to move forward with purpose in improving the future. And when I talk about Bexley's history, I'm not trying to pretend that nothing that I just talked about exists today, because that's not true. We know that racism is alive today. We know that bias is alive today, both explicit and implicit. And we know that we have seen outrageous examples of that on the national stage. And we know that undoubtedly there are examples of that in our own community. And so it's incredibly important because of that we as leaders and we as community members all work together to collectively talk about and learn from the issues that we're talking about tonight. Now, I've been asked to share one of my own personal stories, and I'm going to tell you a story that has definitely impacted my role as the safety director in Bexley and as the mayor in Bexley, and prior to that as a city council member. When I was just out of college, which in and of itself was a position of privilege, I had a day when I showed up at the BMV trying to sort out a problem. I hadn't shaved, I didn't feel very well, I was wearing scruffy clothing, and I got in a situation where an officer of the law abused his position of power and made my life incredibly miserable for a series of months. It was a position that I didn't deserve, and it was a position that I never expected to be in. I grew up, like many of the residents in Bexley, in a privileged bubble in many ways. And to have my world turned upside down by a police officer was a shock to my system. I never expected it would happen. Not unlike Lori Ann, I had viewed law enforcement as a good friend, somebody who would always be there all the time. And I learned on one day, very quickly, that one person and one perspective could dramatically alter my life. Now, I had resources to fight that injustice, and I had support networks to fight that injustice, and I had, frankly, the right demographic to help me fight that injustice. And I want to think that we as a community, we as a country, need to work increasingly away from that imbalance of power and that imbalance of influence. For many, many years, anytime I would see a police officer, my blood pressure would just go through the roof. I would start shaking. I remember the first time I got pulled over after that, I was driving to church, true story, and I think I was speeding. I was. And blue lights lit up behind me, and it had been maybe a few years since the story. I didn't really give you the whole story, but a few years. And I started shaking uncontrollably. I could not control myself. And the officer pulled me over and explained that I'd been speeding. I admitted that I'd been speeding. And he gave me a warning, which was very nice of him. I'm not going to ramble, but my point is, I've had subsequent very positive experiences with police officers, and I've been lucky to be in that position. I remember going on a bike ride with our chief around the city. I can't remember if I was a council member or maybe just recently had become mayor. Do you remember?
You were council.
I was on council.
Finance director, I was really working him hard.
So we're biking around the city and kind of seeing what it's like to be a police officer on a bike, maybe. And I told the chief my story. And it was a moment, it was a liminal moment for me, a moment of understanding, a moment of conversation. It was a moment of healing, frankly. It was a moment where I could explain what had happened to me and how it had impacted my view of law enforcement and how it impacted my view as a council member. I think there had been an ordinance having to do with mayor's court sentencing and charges, and I explained to the chief why I voted the way I voted. And through that conversation, we learned, I think I learned something, I hope he learned something, and he shared his own story. And I hope that today is going to be like that. I hope that as we talk through these stories, and I understand that even as I had a story that traumatized me as a 22-year-old or whatever age I was, and that I've had to learn how to grow as a person through that, I understand that I did that from a position that's so uniquely different than the position of the minority community in Bexley and throughout our country. And I'm cognizant of that, and that's a very vivid experience that has carried me through my leadership as the mayor. In my perspective, whenever I hear concerns about equity and imbalances of power and even specific events that have occurred, I go back to that time. I go back to that memory. And I think humbly that I need to always keep an open mind and always be listening and always be learning. We have been doing a lot of that in Bexley, but we still have a lot further to go. I think we're going to get into some more of those details later this evening. So I'm going to pass the proverbial mic along to our Chief of Police, Larry Reinhardt.
Thank you, Mayor. As the mayor said, I am Larry Reinhardt. I'm the Chief of Police, have been since 2007. I'm here tonight with Sergeant Don Overly. Sergeant Overly has 26 years in law enforcement, and she does a lot of things for this police department. I'm glad she could join us tonight. She runs our Citizens Police Academy. The list of things that she is responsible for and does a great job with is too long for me to read, but I'm very appreciative that she is with us. I'm also with Officer. That's a Freudian slip, wasn't it? Not yet.
There you go.
Officer John Bird. Now, John has been a detective and has done a great job for the organization as a detective, and now back as a patrol officer. Great experience. Been in law enforcement 13 years, and I'm very glad that John could join us tonight. The Bexley Police Department has 31 sworn badge-carrying police officers, and that includes me and the deputy chief. We're a small organization. We don't have lieutenants and majors. We have officers, sergeants, one deputy chief, and one chief. 16% of those sworn officers are non-white, and we feel pretty good about that. In fact, as a community-oriented police department, a community policing agency, we felt really good about ourselves for a long, long time. And there have been several times that the Minority Parents Alliance has reached out to us to talk about issues, and we met and we talked. But these past few weeks, I have realized, and I think many members of our agency have realized, we didn't listen well enough. We didn't hear what the Minority Parents Alliance was trying to share with us. We didn't hear the benefit of the dialogue. You were trying to say, hey, everything's not perfect in being a person of color coming through Bexley or living in Bexley, and I'm so humbled that the Minority Parents Alliance will continue to work with us. You never gave up on us. You continue to come back and say, we need to talk more. One thing that you said maybe a couple years ago that really resonated with me was you said, listen, we just don't want our kids to grow up in Bexley and be afraid of the police. Now that resonated with me. And that's the approach that your organization has always taken. And I thank you for that. And I thank you that you have never beat us up. You've never gotten mad at us and walked away from the table. You've continued to come back. Well, these past few weeks, it's just been obvious. Even though we pride ourselves as a police department of being empathetic, we haven't been very empathetic. We haven't listened. We haven't heard the true experience. And I won't get into some of the stories now, but we're listening now. We're listening now. We're listening as an agency now. There are good people on this police department. We have a very high hiring standard, and we have accumulated some of the finest police officers anywhere. And I promise you, we're listening now. And I also will tell you right now, those times that maybe we were more defensive than we needed to be, and we didn't hear what you were saying, and we didn't hear the stories about what your children were experiencing. I own that. Because empathy and listening and the tone of this agency certainly starts at the top. It starts with me. And I apologize for our deafness, but I promise you we are listening. We want to serve every corner of this community, and we want to understand what your experience is here with law enforcement and living in this community. And we're willing to work hard. We're willing to listen and to work hard and to hear what you have to say, and we're willing to change. I mean, we're a small agency, and the beauty of that is we can shift the way we do business overnight. Giant agencies can't, and we see that all over the news. We can, and we have good police officers. We have an incredible community. A great support channel here in this town. It's a great place to work. So we can change and be what we need to be to serve every element of this community, and we're going to do that. We're committed to that. And again, I appreciate you. You never gave up on us. You continued to come back, and you came back professionally, not attacking. Well, you do have our attention, and we want to listen and we want to grow. And I'm hoping that anybody who has a comment, question of me, Sergeant Overley, Officer Byrd, please just type your question in to the comment space of the Facebook thread. And I look forward to seeing how this, did I mess that up, Don? The mayor knew what I meant.
Sort of.
But
Use your typewriter.
But yes, yeah, sorry. Gee, Renee, that's how it's gonna go. But thank you very much. I don't know who goes after me.
I think we're ready for some questions now. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen for the sweet voices of our moderators who are off screen. Brian Drury and Monica Williams are gathering the questions. Do you have any questions for us? Yes, yet? Oh, yes,
Actually,
they
no,
do.
I have questions.
All right, well, let's get
We
started.
appreciate everybody from asking those, so we'll start off. It seems to be that on Main Street and Broad Street, that primarily African-American drivers are stopped. Why is that? And that would be to anybody.
Well, I can start with that.
Great.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I know it appears that way. I don't know the demographics of drivers on Broad Street and Main Street. I don't know what the percentages should be to be considered fair. I don't know. We talk about it every week, the mayor and I. But I promise you, that's not intentional. I know it's easy to not believe me. There is nobody on this police department that goes out in a patrol car and says, I'm going to find an African American to stop. That's not intentional, but I certainly know that it appears that way. And honestly, I don't know how to fix that, Mayor. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, before we even go there, I think we should talk a little bit about what our demographics and traffic stops actually say. So one of the things we're working on, and we talked about it at council on Tuesday night, is a transparency report to the community so that every year we're reporting on our demographics as it pertains to police statistics as well as use of force and other key metrics. One thing that we have been doing in gathering that information is we've been looking at our 2019 figures, and I don't have them off the top of my head, but I think that the number of African Americans stopped in the entire city, so I'm not sure how it breaks out to Broad and Main, is in somewhere around the 50% mark, over
Yes,
or under
sir.
that, I'm not sure.
Yes, sir.
And so, again, one of the things we talk about is we need to understand better how that compares to our driving population, and learn from that, learn from looking at those statistics at a deeper level and trying to better understand that. But so I think first addressing, you could have a stereotype on either side. One of the stereotypes would be that every single person that the police department pulls over, and I've read those comments on my own thread, is a person from a minority population. We know that that's not the case statistically. So with that at least placed, we don't know whether or not that number is higher or lower than it would be based on the average driver population. That's information we're working on. And what was the question you'd actually asked me?
You answered it perfectly. man.
Okay,
Thank
I
you.
wasn't sure.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, did you just say that the number of, the percentage of people stopped is 50% people of color?
I think around that, or non-white, I think.
It's hard to get a good number because a lot of times it's unknown. And we're not gonna ask somebody.
Okay.
So what
That
do you
just
think?
seems a little high. That seems very high. Considering that, I mean, I get that people can drive through Bexley. They come from all over Columbus. It's an open community. We're not gated very part of, little bit it's gated. But other than that, like people drive through to get to downtown and other places. But that just seems to me, as an African American woman, like that just seems like a really high number.
If you're looking at our demographics for the city alone, it would be incredibly high. And I know a lot of people look at those numbers and think, my goodness, that's incredibly, but the volume of traffic that comes through this city is incredible every day. I think a lot of the drivers don't even know they're in Bexley, but there's such a high volume of traffic through here. And let me ask Officer Byrd, because he works patrol in a patrol car. Would you agree with that? That the demographics, that the traffic on Broad and Main is almost a city unto itself.
Absolutely. There's, and if I could expand on that a little bit more, just as far as, I guess, the perception of, black people being pulled over more so than, white people, or, as a patrol officer, I did 5 years of patrol, and then I did 5 years of detective bureau, and now I've come back out to patrol. And I just want to say that, as a patrol officer, a lot of times before we actually make a traffic stop, we have no clue what the race of that driver is. Especially, I like to run radar. I'm not really good at guessing distances, but, radar, I'm picking up that person's speed, maybe 50, 75 yards away. Maybe that's a greater distance, but, somewhere, and basically I can't tell the race of that driver until they're almost, within like 10 feet of me. So, that's one way that, we have no clue of knowing what that race of that driver is. Also, most cars, or not most, a lot of cars nowadays have tinted windows. Once again, it makes it very hard for us to know the race of that driver. If we're behind a car and we haven't, it wasn't like we were stationed somewhere and we saw them go by. If we just get behind a car and run their license plate for one reason or another, a lot of times we do not know the race of that driver until the picture pops up. If a BMV picture pops up, we don't have any clue what the race of that driver is until we get that picture from the BMV once we run their license plate. So, I could see, how maybe, just driving by that might be your perspective, but, as a patrol officer, a lot of times we do not know the race of that driver until we actually make contact with them.
So then, would you know if there's a high percentage of people who were stopped who are just Columbus residents, once you kind of look at their license and that sort of thing? Do you keep that kind of information if they're Bexley residents or Columbus residents?
I would think that might be available in our data system. I've never tried to pull that.
Okay.
I have never tried to get that info. We have a pretty complex data system that we're still working on. We're still working with. But that's a good question.
I think a natural question that kind of pops up when we talk about it too is, well, okay, so why are we doing so much enforcement on Broad and Main Street? And that question gets asked a lot because Broad and Main Street are pass-through streets in the city. So why would that be our focus? Ostensibly, if you're targeting a different street for enforcement purposes, you're going to be focused more on Bexley residents on, say, Cassidy or Drexel. And the reason for that is when we look at our traffic, our accident statistics and our pedestrian hits, they are vastly focused at Broad Street and Main Street. So that's where our accidents are happening. That's where cyclists are being hit. That's where pedestrians are being hit. So that is, and maybe someone, Sergeant Overley, who hasn't spoken yet, could speak to why those are our priority streets.
So with Broad Street's 35 miles per hour, we've clocked cars 170. We had a fatality up on Broad Street doing the speed limit. However, it was just a freak accident. We had a fatality up there. So our officers do hang out up there a little bit more than driving through the side streets. with Main Street, like the mayor said, the pedestrians, we've got a lot of pedestrians that, you know, we like to go where there's action. You know, not always is there action on Euclair or something like that. You know, you can drive down through there, but you like to get up to the main and broad streets where you can stop a speeder from creating, making a bad move, maybe running a red light and causing an accident, or someone on Main Street striking a pedestrian.
Okay, thank you very much for the very thorough response to our first question. That was the first question. I'd like you to know that we do have dozens more.
Cut us off.
So, in follow-up to that question, we've gotten the following question in a number of different ways, and I tried to consolidate it for just one question, and that is, what specific action will the police department take to create more transparency about the data that you do have?
That's a good question. We're working with the data system, and the mayor is one of our more tech-oriented minds, and he knows how he wants those numbers to be. You talked about a periodic posting of all of those numbers, Your Honor?
Yeah, so a couple of things we're working on along those lines. We've been working on a accountability and transparency report. Actually started working on it at the end of 2019. It got sidelined with COVID-19 and flooding and you know, all the things that we've been dealing with this year. Not an excuse, but that's kind of why that has been delayed. The idea with that report would be to show a breakdown of enforcement by demographic, not just stops, but warnings versus citations. And I think another misconception is that pretty consistently, am I allowed to say what our warning rate is compared to citations?
Yes, sir.
Pretty consistently, 70% of police stops in Bexley result in a warning as opposed to a citation. And that's actually fairly consistent across the different demographics of people being stopped. So we'll be developing a report that goes actually for 2019 and 18. One of the things we want to do is be able to understand our driving population and be able to understand better, overlay that data over that. We haven't yet found a way to scientifically get that in a way that's not creepy.
Well, I volunteer my professional expertise to help in this endeavor.
Well, and Mr. Drury, who's off camera, has done some of his own informal surveys, so he can speak to that. But obviously, we want to be looking at strong data, and it helps us too, because it helps us understand where the concerns are. But also reporting on use of force, which is obviously an incredibly important topic. Bexley Police Department has a pretty low incidence of use of force events, but nonetheless, we want to be able to provide that information clearly and transparently. And I don't know if, Monica, you can maybe help me. This question, I think, was starting to tip on questions of accountability and transparency. And the Citizen Review Board model is one that we've been working on for a while. And if you didn't catch it, because you might not have been one of the people steadfastly watching our council meeting on Tuesday night, Bexley announced and rolled out a Citizen Review Board on Tuesday. We're the first community in Central Ohio to have it. It's a review board of citizens who, if there is a complaint of bias or discrimination from any member of city staff, that includes the police department and includes service workers, code enforcement, which is actually one where we obviously need to be sensitive to those issues. And if a complaint is filed, if the report back that's internal is not satisfactory to the complainant, then they can file an appeal. And part of that appeal process is that a citizen review board will review that complaint, will review the record, and will issue a report. That report is public record. It is fully available for release to the public and for viewing by the public. In fact, our policy asks that report be posted to our website. And from that report, the appeal will be heard. And I know that I need to not talk too much because I know we have more questions. But the initial 3 members of the Citizen Review Advisory Board in Bexley are Brian Drury, who you'll be meeting later this evening, the head of the Bexley Minority Parents Alliance. Becky Guzman, who's a public defender and has helped me in mayor's court reforms. And Lee Nathans, who is a longtime resident and has a academic background in police leadership and a good perspective. So that is in place. We are now the only community in Central Ohio to have it. I want to thank the chief of police and helping us to move that forward, because it's obviously, let's be honest, it's not typically a device that's very welcomed by police departments. But my perspective has been that in order for us to move forward, we need to provide the utmost amount of transparency and accountability. And if we truly believe in ourselves, as we do, and if we truly are committed to always improving, as we are, then there's nothing for us to hide. And so that's an announcement we made on Tuesday night.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, next question, hopefully you can hear me, is will the Bexley City and Police adopt the 8 Can't Wait campaign of the 8 things that we have a discussion on as far as police changes?
I don't want to answer this question. You want me to answer the
Well,
question?
this is something we've all been working on, and it all lands on the mayor's desk, the final product.
So, the 8 Can't Wait is part of the Use of Force project. And it's 8 policy objectives to put in place to make sure that use of force by police is a last resort, that it is obviously in any way possible non-lethal. It involves banning carotid holds, which is a form of chokehold, or actually chokeholds in general. And we reviewed our policies relative to the 8 Can't Wait. We satisfied 7 of the 8, and the 8th was amended on Tuesday
Yes, sir.
as well. So Bexley is now fully compliant with the 8 Can't Wait use of force project.
Fantastic, thank you, sir. The next question is a little bit different than some of the other questions, and I thought we could spend some time on this. What should white residents in Bexley do in response to the climate in the country in general?
I think she's looking at me. You know, that is something that my family and I have had a tremendous amount of conversation about. Last week, we found ourselves on vacation celebrating my husband and my 25th wedding anniversary, and our children were with us. And our youngest is 14 and our oldest is 22, and there were major pieces of conversation that we had about that. And to a great extent, we throw up our hands and say, we don't know. We don't know what we can do. What can we do? I have, suggested to my children, to listen, to educate ourselves, to try really hard to reach out to our Black friends for any suggestions that they might be willing to do. It is not the Black community's responsibility to educate the white community about the past that has hurt them so much. But it is our responsibility to live fully in the future and do what we can to make people feel comfortable and good, and to celebrate everyone's color, whether they're white, purple, green, or orange. To celebrate each other and what's good about them. I threw up my hands and I sat and I literally called every Black friend that I have and reached out to them and said, I care about you. What would you suggest I do? I just want you to know that I love you. And Monica Williams was one of those people that I reached out to and I called. And as awkward as it was, and as unsettling and uneasy as it was, because what do you say? You say, I'm calling because I just want you to know I love you. I'm thinking about you. How's your family doing? How are they getting through this? And you know what? Monica sent me everything she could think of in a text of things that I should watch, read, learn about. My dear friend Deborah did the same thing. She happens to have my son's dear friend, and she knows my heart. She knows my heart is good and that I want to make a difference, but I don't always know how. But as a council member, I can tell you that you can hold our feet to the fire, that you can keep the conversation going. We want the conversation to keep going. We want the dialogue every day. We want good suggestions, and we will try to seek out as many ideas as we possibly can to be change makers. But we need the dialogue to continue.
I'll go real quick. Sure. So thank you very much for that. And I guess one thing I would say is just to be supportive and just for humanity overall, right? So just say, give us your opinion. This was wrong. This was messed up. Like, just from that standpoint, this situation happened wherever it was just wrong. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is to use and recognize that there's privilege involved, right? And that there's actually an advocacy that non-minority community members have that minority members don't have, quite honestly, and to use that advocacy or that privilege, if you will, to advocate. And then I think to take take a step into the water of uncomfortability, if you will, but then don't forget about us in 3 months. Mm-hmm. When all the cameras are stopped rolling, when all the protests have subsided, and just still say, how are you doing? And to use your influence, your privilege within your realm of influence to help all people, African American or otherwise, through situations. So if you want to say, hey, I'm here for you, which is great, and then there's an opportunity at work where there's a hiring decision that could go 50-50 or whatever the case is, I think our conversation internally would be, is the support there just when the cameras are rolling or even months and months later? So that's one thing I want to say about all that. And also, one more thing. Okay, I'll pass this to my wife.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. We have more questions.
Just to jump back on what you were saying, Lorianne, is I appreciate, because we have been the recipients of, people sending texts and sending love and writing letters, and we support you and we love you, and we're here for you, and that's wonderful, and I appreciate it, and I'm not in any way making that as a small thing, because it's not, and it's weird and it's awkward, because we are beginning to have those conversations that are yucky and they make you feel bad and you don't want to have them, and my God, why didn't we fix this 50 years ago, and why are we still having these conversations, and they don't feel good. But I appreciate them because we need to have them. I think the thing that I appreciate too, Alicia Mitchell gave a great speech on the Bexley conversation on Sunday about people saying, to those conversations that we're not privy to, that things aren't okay. It's not okay to make a racist joke. It's not okay to make an off-color comment. It's not okay to say things, just in your circle of white friends that you wouldn't say in front of a mixed crowd. And so I feel like that's what we need too. We need to have those, I love you, I'm with you, I support you, all that. But we also, at the family gatherings, at the Christmas dinner, at the Sunday picnic, we don't have picnics anymore, but we need that kind of advocacy, because that's what makes those lasting deep changes.
You mentioned Monika's list, and it involved learning, and it involved thinking and learning and being, and the Bexley Library has been a great partner with the city and other organizations in helping to host conversations like this, but implicit bias trainings for the community. And I think what I have noticed in a lot of those events is that we see a lot of the same residents, which is great because we have a dedicated and loyal resident fan base on those issues. But there are a whole lot of residents we don't see. And I think the question of what do I do? Reach out to your neighbor. Say, hey, come with me to the library. Come with me when we're allowed to come back to the library. Come with me to a screening out in the lawn as we watch a documentary together. Some of the stuff we're planning on in the coming months and years. Let's have this conversation because these are hard conversations. And the reality is that when it comes to policing and when it comes to interchange that occurs within our community in policing, a lot of the times when we review situations that have been heated or charged or somebody felt deeply misunderstood or wrongfully accused, it's involved an initial call that was made by a resident. And we do need to call when we see things that, when something doesn't quote unquote seem right. But that's a really difficult decision in the lens of implicit bias. And so talking and being purposeful and thinking through that piece of it, I think is incredibly important as a community. And we want our community to be safe. We also want our community to be just and equitable.
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry. This is what we want. We would like to have, a sincere conversation and dialogue. Go ahead, Ms. Baker. How do the police and, maybe, on the heels of the Central Park caller and the weaponization of calling the police and saying, there's a black man attacking me, how is the Bexley police responding? And I'm not saying that you're not, but maybe you can speak more so that we know, hey, you're not just gonna send a patrol car out because there's a black man walking in the alley. So how can you help us to understand how you're kind of de-weaponizing calling 911 when there's a spotting of a black person?
I'll go first. It is Sergeant Overly who supervises the dispatchers. Will correct me if I'm wrong. But I think our dispatchers have become very in tune to that. When somebody calls and says, hey, there's a suspicious person, middle of the day, there's a suspicious person on my street. Our dispatchers know the questions to answer or to ask, and they've become very good at that. Ma'am, what are they doing that's suspicious? Well, they're walking down the street slowly, looking around. Okay, ma'am, is that all they're doing? And the dispatchers have become very good at peeling the layers back and determining. I think so. Maybe, I don't know if Don will agree with me, but I think they've become very good at peeling those layers back and determining whether or not this is a real suspicious person, or maybe somebody's got some bias that they're not managing very well. And usually it comes down to the question or the statement of, well, I know they don't live on this street. Okay. Well, that's not necessarily suspicious, but even when we're in a situation where we still have to send a car, oftentimes the officer will just drive by. And when the officer just drives by, if the person is just walking down the street, maybe took another way to wherever they were going, or maybe just wanted to walk down the street and see the houses that were on that street. We have some streets here that are very unique. The officer will drive by, and I hear that from the patrol officers. They tell me that, you know what, it's been a long time since we've been quick to jump on that like it's a real suspicion. We make sure as best we can from the dispatcher perspective. Don, what?
The chief is correct when he says that our dispatchers, all but one, has several years of experience. And they do an amazing job at making sure they're getting the information as why the caller feels this individual just doesn't fit in the community. But I want it to be understood, though, that we still have to respond to stuff. And it makes it hard for us, because we know in our minds, this individual's not doing anything, they're just out for a walk. But we still, like the chief said, we still have to drive by, regardless of, regardless of what we're thinking. And that's why we just drive by and turn the block and they're not doing anything. I do this, I'm on my radio. We're clear, sorry.
Let me ask you this.
Uh-huh.
My impression, you tell me if I'm wrong, my impression is we don't get quite as many of those calls as we once did, calls that we think are just race related. We don't get as many of those, do we?
I don't hear as many.
And that's a good thing if they're lessening.
Officer Byrd, I don't know what he experiences out on the road.
I don't think we do as much. You know, the calls we're getting, I feel, are legit. Like people, you know, stealing bikes or stuff. They're pretty legit now.
So it's not like, and it wasn't always that way.
But yeah,
There was a time, even in my time here, that we got a lot of those calls. And it was kind of I don't want to say a joke in the radio room, because the dispatchers knew, wait a minute, come on now. But we have good dispatchers. When you say we have really good police dispatchers,
So we're going to move on to another question. I'd like to just say, based on some of the feedback that we're getting in the comments section, that the purpose of this meeting is to continue a dialogue that highlights some of the good things that the city is doing to partner with the community and some of the practices that they've put in place to ensure that the Bexley Police Department is treating all of its residents fairly. This is a discussion. We have received several dozen questions. We're going to try to get through them, but we do want to allow the panel to have an opportunity to weigh in and add value to the answer, so that the answers aren't just single-minded and focused on one person's opinion, but allow all the panel members, if appropriate, to weigh in. So, so far it's going really well, and we're going to move on to another question. Brian?
Okay, what is the status of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and why was it disbanded?
I would like to take that one. Because I believe that that question was asking about a group that I helped form several years ago. It was called the Diversity and Inclusion Collaborative. And initially it started out as a group of the city, the school district, the library, Capital University, CSG, St. Charles, and Bexley Minority Parents Alliance joined at some point along the way. And the purpose of that collaborative was to encourage these sorts of conversations, programming implicit bias, community implicit bias training, hosting new resident events to try to welcome new residents to the community so they felt included, reaching out to neighboring communities. And as that group developed, what happened was we had more and more residents coming in who were very appropriately bringing up some of the issues that we're talking about tonight, and talking about how can we change, what can we do to change. Incredibly appropriate questions. But it shifted focus. We started to lose some of our institutional partners, and it became a question of how to work on internal reforms in the city of Bexley. So we engaged with a consultant, a diversity consultant by the name of Steve Francis, who helped us create a strategic plan within the city to encourage Bexley as a welcoming community for all, and to start to carry through with a lot of what we're talking about. It became really clear that the structure of that group was functioning more as a independent grassroots organization that was agitating very appropriately for change. But it was difficult to wear two hats, where we were appointing members to a group, but also responding to a grassroots group. It didn't make sense for us to be running a grassroots organization from within the city of Bexley. So when we finalized our strategic plan, which council's actually is going to be voting on and is currently discussing, at the end of 2019, we encouraged the residents who'd become really active in that group to form their own grassroots organization, not unlike the Bexley Minority Parents Alliance, where they were working as a partner, but they could set their own agenda. It didn't have to be something that the city was steering. There's a really great, very valid purpose for groups from the outside to push for change, and it's incredibly important, and our ears are open and our eyes are open. that group has I believe has formed. It's now the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion group. And alongside that, we have the LGBTQIA group, we have the Bexley Minority Parents Alliance group, and we have the Bexley Anti-Racism Project. So we have a number of advocacy groups that are working in lots of different ways to encourage reform and progress in the community. There has been from that conversation, I've read plenty of social media posts very similar to the question that was just asked about why the city got rid of that group. And I very earnestly feel that the city wrapped up a project and encouraged grassroots organizing. And tonight is an example of how we want to work together with entities throughout the city from a variety of interests and continuously improving.
Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add? Well, I think I have a good follow-up question, and it's actually a two-part question. I combined a couple of different questions into one, and that is, how is the city actively recruiting minority candidates to be a part of the city, the police department, and also the school district? And then part two of the question is around training. Does the city and the police department have ongoing training for implicit bias or unconscious bias? I'll ask that the chief, the mayor, and Jonathan Baker all weigh in on those questions.
Well, in that order, I'll start with the police department. We've changed over the past 5 or 6 years. We've completely rebuilt our hiring process. Maybe it's been more years than that. And we start now with a national testing network that is just that many police departments use. The testing process it includes video testing and a variety of things. It's actually conducted at a couple local learning institutions, and it has been determined to have the least adverse impact of any of those testing processes. It's out of our hands. The candidate goes, takes the test, checks what police departments they want to apply for, and that's where the whole thing starts. I attribute that to our 16% of our agency now being non-white. We've hired a lot of new officers just since I've been here. And that's because I think it's very fair, user-friendly for people of all races, color, creed, sexual orientation. It doesn't discriminate. At least it's as least discriminatory as exists right now. And that has contributed, that's attracted a lot of people to this agency. I also think that culturally in Bexley, the Bexley Police Department is known to be, and I know a lot of people maybe won't believe this, it's known to be a very professional organization with a very high hiring standard, and that's attractive to minority candidates. Our command structure is a very fair, unbiased command structure, and people know that people go where they can have the best career, I think. And that's how we've attracted so many officers of color. And they can pick and choose because there's so many agencies that are trying to hire. And that's a big deal for us because we don't have, you might spend your whole career here, not John Bird, but you might spend your whole career here and not be a sergeant because we're just small. And you're not going to be on a SWAT team. You're never going to be in a canine unit.
We don't have a SWAT team.
And you're never going to be in the mounted horse unit. And the helicopter unit, the mayor won't fund that. So my point is we don't have specialized units. We're too small. We use mutual aid for that. So anyway, that's what we've done. And we do spread the word. I mean, we try to get the word spread into minority areas, and it's working. I would think 16%, we feel pretty good about that. And I think that's only going to increase because I think minority officers believe this is a good place to come and be a police officer. I think. That's the police department. Oh, implicit bias training. You know, we do ongoing, in fact, it's almost weekly now, and I'll tell you how that works. Implicit bias, issues of diversity. We use the Attorney General's web portal, and we use Lexipol, who is a national organization that oversees our policy. Now, we have a lot of control in tweaking and changing policy, and the mayor just exercised that in the last week. But they also send out every day. You know, policy is a great, wonderful thing, and we're a policy-driven organization, but it's no good if the officers aren't trained and held accountable to know the language in the policy. Every day, officers get questions to their email that they have to answer about policy. And our focus certainly has been implicit bias in all issues of diversity. We also subscribe to an online organization called Police One, and we pay them. We pay them for additional training. So our officers they're getting it from 3 different directions on an ongoing basis. No longer do we just have one annual time that we talk about implicit bias, and no longer do we just have one annual time when you're tested on policy. It's an ongoing process. Now, I speak to that as though I'm the guy that made all that happen. I am not. I have good people that work at the organization. The deputy chief has really burrowed into this to determine how we can continue that ongoing training. Every sergeant is involved in it. I mean, I'm glad to take credit for it and speak to it publicly, but I can't take credit for it. I have a lot of good people that make that happen.
So in addition to that, the police department was the first department in the city to undergo routine implicit bias training. Since then, we've partnered with the Curran Institute at OSU and had implicit bias training workshops for our non-police staff and for our elected officials, and we plan to continue to do that. In addition to that, we've been talking about above and beyond some of the online coursework for the police department, working on more localized training that's more informal, more based upon empathy, more based upon understanding about some of the issues we've been talking about this evening. So this is one of the things we talked about Tuesday evening. We've also engaged with a diversity consultant to audit our hiring practices throughout the city and our purchasing practices. That engagement started in early 2020. It's ongoing, and we've already been learning a whole lot about recruitment techniques and ways to kind of broaden the way that we're looking for great candidates for city employment.
I think the chief and the mayor talked about it in terms of what we're doing. I'm going to kind of talk about it more from a personal standpoint, so I appreciate, as a resident, the efforts that are being put in place. The Curran Institute is like down the street from where I work at the university. And so for me, an issue could be in terms of implicit bias or unconscious bias is with gender, you know, and so I've learned to be aware of my own biases and then the question becomes, how do I counteract those? And so, for example, I may have an unconscious bias that I feel safer walking around on campus at night, and it turns out that my students, so my smaller female students, may feel less comfortable. And so I've had to make some changes myself. I may have an unconscious bias growing up in Chicago, listening to certain music and having certain experiences with law enforcement that I'm actually, true confession, more against law enforcement, my natural self. That's my bias against law enforcement. And I think what I've had to do was build the trust, hang out, go to the police department, see it from a different perspective, talk to the chief, have Dawn over to the house for a cookout. Like, these kind of things are helping counteract my bias with actual real life experiences that have been positive. And I think that's so I think that's what needs to happen, whether it's with law enforcement or with race relations. You recognize your bias and then kind of counteract it like a muscle, strengthen it, so then you can respond in the right situation.
Can I ask a question just to piggyback on all of that? I think I told some people that I had a cousin who was in Texas. I don't know if he's watching. Hey, cuz. He was a cop for 30 years and retired 5 years ago. And we talked a lot about the culture within police departments and what happens if there's a bad cop or if there's a bad situation or what have you, you know. And I appreciate the implicit bias, I appreciate the implicit bias training and the unconscious bias training. I'm just wondering if you guys can speak to what is the culture within actually the police department that if somebody does something, if somebody says something that's out of line or says something against women or says something against, people of color or somebody, like what is that culture like, and is it accepted? I mean, one of the things that my cousin was talking about is that it is very, very hard in some departments to speak up when you see something wrong because there's this code.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so the only way that you change the code is to change the culture. So maybe if you guys could talk about what that culture is like when somebody does see something within yourself. Not necessarily that it's just coming from the outside, from the public, like a complaint, but anyway.
How do we self-police?
Thank you.
And that's policy driven. I will tell you this, when I came here in 07, I was struck by how we not only followed policy, and I've said this to the sergeants before, if you have an infraction in the organization and you violate policy, you're written up and it goes in your file for the appropriate amount of time. I had people who came in and said, hey, I had sergeants. I experienced sergeants come and say, hey, I was a little bit late. I shouldn't have been, and I need to have paper in my file for that. And I thought that's unheard of. I've never heard of that. I inherited a very disciplined, very policy-driven organization, and I think I probably owe that to the police chief that was here before me. But I inherited that. Sergeants have continued that. There's a standard at this agency that I still see every day, and I think, wow. I mean, third shift. I get in at 5 in the morning, 5:15 sometimes. I need to see third shift before they go home. They don't get off till 6:30. Every organization I've been associated with, they're in the locker room at 6:20, changing. I watch those officers, they stand downstairs in full uniform with all their gear, even while the next shift is suiting up to go, or going out the door, and it's 6:30 they go up the stairs. That's a policy issue. I think our culture, and I think the way we police each other is incredible. Would you agree with that, Sergeant Overly? I don't think we have a lot of time.
Okay. It's not tolerated. If there is a comment made, it's not tolerated by the sergeants. It's not tolerated within the officers. And we've dealt with that. I was the only female at my agency for quite some time. So there were times where I had to say, I don't appreciate what you just said. And I have the backing of my fellow officers. And it's just educating. Right. It's educating. And we don't tolerate that. It's easy for me to sit here and say that. I just hope you believe it, because it's very true. It does not happen.
I've worked in broken cultures, and I tell you, I know y'all got to wrap this up, but no, you can't change culture. I know the books say you can, the schools say you can. I've tried, and other agencies. When I came here and found this culture to be so good, I thought, and the reason I say you can't change culture is because you think you might do it to attrition? Who trains your new officers? The older officers, and it perpetuates itself.
Right.
I'm thankful that we don't have that problem
A
here.
lot of that comes from our community. Our officers love our community.
They do.
So
They
we
do. They
So-
know us. They know all of us. They know who's related to whom. They know, they do. And it's amazing.
We're gonna move on to the next question. Thank you all.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So we talked in this information about data, and so several questions to saying, okay, if we have this data, will be shared, will that information be given? And on top of that, also combining with that is like, what are the police policies and guidelines, and how's that, so people know from there, what is the procedure and policy? So it's kind of a two-part, but information being shared. It's like communication from there to say, because people are going, this is number here, this number there, I don't know. I got my eyeballs, I see this and that information is that number once you get your data, will that be shared?
So to start with, we have committed to releasing 2019 and 18 community accountability reports that share the data within the next 6 to 8 weeks. Why does it take us 6 to 8 weeks? Well, your graphic design and compiling staff consists of myself and Sam Metcalf, who's off camera over here, is our communications coordinator, and then the police department, which is we are a lean organization. Bexley is not, I'm not going to name any names, but we are not other suburbs in central Ohio that have a deep field of folks who can communicate and compile and report. So we're going to develop a report. We've committed to doing that in the past, and we're still working on it, and we've committed to expedite that, even in the midst of a lot of the stuff that we've been working on here at the city of Bexley. As it pertains to police policy, and we started to talk about how to publish police policy in a more transparent way. We haven't really had that conversation very completely yet. So, Chief, I'm going to pass that one to you.
That's, I don't know what policy it's appropriate to post online for everybody to see and what policy it might not be. For instance, any policy that has to do with some of our operational stuff, there's just some concern there about some of our operational practices that shouldn't be out there in the public venue. But that's probably just a little bit of it. Most of the policy, we have great policy and it's all online. I guess we just need to talk more about that, what we think's appropriate to be out there in the public venue and what's not.
Well, an example of that is the 8 can't wait question, use of force project. So we have a use of force policy, but it's not the only policy that we have that pertains to use of force. And so in order to provide a complete answer to that question, Captain Goff was digging through all of our policies to give a full picture. And he's worked on a report, which now needs to be updated because we changed the policy. But that report needs to get out, and we're going to get that out, and that will provide an analysis of our policies, an expose of this. So if there are issues of concern to the community, first off, many of those policies are public record, and we'll work on releasing them. And as topics gather interest and attention, we'll work on communicating clearly about what they are.
Thank you very much. The next question is along the same lines as policy, and it is, what anti-racist policies is the city council planning to implement regarding housing discrimination, supporting minority businesses, etc.?
Those are great questions. We did in 2015, I was a co-sponsor of the anti-discrimination ordinance in 2015. Prior to COVID-19 and all kinds of crazy stuff going on, I was in the midst of talking to individuals about writing an ordinance to help with the whole equity and using vouchers as ways of paying for rental properties for individuals. And we will continue with this amendment to our strategic plan. It is a fluid piece, a piece that has now been read once, will be read at least 2 more times. But we want to be transparent with that. We want our community to be involved. We want their input. We want them to come to council via Zoom or in person, and we will do everything we can to make sure that we hear as many voices concerning that as possible. And we are ready for new ideas and anxious. We too have done implicit bias, and we would like for that to continue at least every 2 years. We have been in contact with people at Capital University, and we are hoping that our council and perhaps the school board will be permitted to audit the freshman course that every freshman at Capital has to take concerning racism and diversity and inclusion. So we're trying, and we are ready to listen to any other. I hope I answered the question, but we are ready to listen and to have conversations with our community.
I have a question. Okay, so you see me now with the suit and jacket on, and so, but I'm also an African American boy that became a man. And so if you look at the protests, a lot of the issues were, a lot of the concerns were women and parents wondering about their young boys' safety. Will these young boys make it home? And as someone who's kind of grown up, now I'm a middle-aged man, I'm representing their voice today in many ways. That's who I am. When you see me on the street with a hoodie, you don't know that I have a PhD. And so my comment is more so, we can feel targeted. And I get it from the percentage standpoint in terms of Columbus is on the outside there, and you know, odds are I'm not from Columbus, or I'm not from Bexley, I'm from Columbus, I'm trespassing. But we can feel targeted. And there's that whole thing about feeling like harassed and bullied compared to protected and served. And if we're feeling targeted, then how can we gain trust from the police? How can we trust the police? How can we feel that the police is going to trust us? And so I'm comforted to hear about the warnings and the lack of force, or not the use of appropriate force.
Yeah.
But we can still feel targeted. And so how do we resolve that piece to the point where, and if I commit a crime, hey, make sure that the punishment fits the crime. But sometimes I'm walking my dog, I get accosted. Sometimes I see children who are white do the same thing I'm doing and they get a pass. That's my perspective, but that's what I see. And I'm speaking about my group as a whole. And it just feels like if we're being targeted, we're getting a little more scrutiny. And we don't want less scrutiny per se, we want appropriate. We want what's equitable. We want the same. And so I think that's all we're asking for, whether that's bikes, whether that's playground, whether that's I'm just walking home with my friends. And in the old vernacular, as Brian and I would say, why the cops always sweating me? You know, and so that's my question, and then I'll leave, and then Brian's gonna step in.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, sure.
I think we have to do that. The only way we can change that is by somehow impacting our officers. Somehow impacting our officers to really understand what you just said. My wake-up moment to that most recently was Monica. And she said something very similar, that you were there. But we have to impact officers, and that's the issue with training. Training discussion. That officers need to leave the room thinking, wow, you know what, he's right. That's an issue. Because I can't change that through contact with you, because that initial contact is when that young man or woman's thinking, why are you stopping talking to me? Mm-hmm. I'm just walking down the street. You know, so we don't really have that opportunity. It's got to be through somehow, and this is the challenge, this is my challenge, to impact officers, to get them in a good setting, a good environment, and you're going to be a part of that for me. Because you have been the Bexley Minority Parents Alliance has been the most effective voice in that now. Because what you just said is impactful, I think, and you didn't attack anybody. You didn't make any false allegations, accusations, you didn't attack anybody. You just explained the situation. That's the same way I need to get that to my police officers. And I have to start with my sergeants, and they need that on an ongoing basis, that understanding. And you know how the only way I'm going to change it, it's not real bad, but it needs to be a heck of a lot better, is in working with you and talking about ways that you can talk to the officers. We can communicate that effectively and impact them. That's
Okay.
the key.
Thanks.
Great. We have 5 more minutes, so I think we're gonna do a wrap up. We've got probably 100 more questions. There, some repeated multiple times. I hear you, but we want to get a chance in there to wrap up and take a call for our next steps.
Next steps, that's what we're talking about right now, next steps.
Yes.
I am going to suggest a next step that I tried very hard, and Monica has to swear that this is truth.
It's true.
I tried not once, but twice to get Monica to run for city council. And when she said no, I called my buddy Patrick and I asked him to run. We need individuals of color in our elected offices. We do. We need your voices. We
And in
need
our
you.
boards,
And our boards and our
commissions.
commissions.
Yep.
And what keeps resonating in my mind is Maya Angelou. It doesn't matter what we say, people will forget it. It doesn't what we do, people will forget it. It's how we make people feel. If we make that child in a hoodie feel like he is less than another white child in the same hoodie, we have failed. We have failed him. And we have to continually think about our next steps and how we can make children of color, adults of color in this community feel like they're every bit a part of this community. And I don't know the answers, but we're going to keep this dialogue going. I don't know if others have the next steps.
That was a fantastic wrap-up. Brian Drury has joined us, who's the chair of Bexley Minority Parents Alliance. Thank you for coming on camera from behind the microphone over there, Brian.
So again, one of the things I was just kind of looking at some of the comments, and I appreciate those. And one of the things that I ask the community is to continue to come and challenge not only the city but also BMPA, but also be a part of it too. The people who've been working on this committee, it's a small group, and we need more people to do more things. So if you're serious and want to make some changes, let us know, and we will do whatever we can to help with that process. We are excited from there about some of the changes. I know people want more, but again, come to city council, talk to them. You've seen the mayor here, talk to them. Police chief, lieutenants from there, talk to them about your concerns. Let them know. We are taking all the information. We'll share that with everybody, but continue like the Bexley. And Jonathan Baker says next meeting is September 17th at 7 p.m.
That's what she was pointing at.
Yeah, thank you.
That's what
But continue to have that ongoing dialogue. The young people from the Bexley Anti-Racist Project from there, I mean, that march moved me. Those young people want change and want change now. So be part of something, do something.
Courtney, did you have any closing thoughts, or am I putting you on the spot?
I don't
Okay.
right now, I'm sorry.
Thank you for joining us this evening. Does anyone else have closing thoughts? I don't want to close anybody off. Thank you again to Minority Parents Alliance for partnering with us, taking questions, helping facilitate the conversation. I hope that we've all learned from each other through this conversation, and I want to ask you, residents of Bexley, Minority Parents Alliance, Police Department, Lorianne Feibel, hold me accountable. Hold Lorianne Feibel accountable for what she's committing here. We've talked about a lot of the new things that we're doing. We've talked about a little bit some of the older stuff we've been doing. We are constantly trying to innovate in this space, and yet, to Brian's point, our perspective is limited. We need more partners in that. We need more voices, and we need to be able to hear from all those perspectives and accommodate those perspectives and learn and grow from those perspectives. For example, Bexley is proud to have the first Citizens Review Board, but that review board's only as good as it gets used appropriately. So the proof is in the pudding, and we are dedicating ourselves to making the pudding right. That's a terrible way of saying it.
It's all right.
I hope that you guys join us September 17th at our next town hall And I know that there are going to be a lot of other opportunities coming up in our community for conversation. I know that the Bexley Anti-Racism Project is organizing weekly events. I know that we'll be hearing more from the DEI group. I know the BMPA is probably going to eventually resume some of their famous cookouts and events and activities to help network in Bexley. We're here to listen, we're here to learn. Thank you for sticking with us tonight, and please reach out. Thank you.